What's up, guys? I'm Chad Barnes, and welcome to the channel. Here, it's all about real car talk, from simple fixes to smart driving tips and keeping your ride in top shape. If that sounds good to you, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button and make sure you watch all the way through. There's a lot of good stuff coming. Let's get to it.
Serial production of BMW X1 began in 2009. The crossover shared a platform with the E91 tricycle, and no one concealed this kinship. The models even have the same wheelbase. And the suspension schemes are the same, only the chassis settings differ. In Russia, the cars appeared quickly, in the same 2009, although at the start only all-wheel drive cars were brought to us at a price from 1.8 million rubles. However, in 2010, assembly began at Kaliningrad Auto Tour. In the engine range appeared junior units, and the base became a rear-wheel drive version of the crossover, and the initial price fell to 1.3 million rubles. In 2012, the crossover underwent a restyling, mainly affecting the technique. Diesel engines became a little more powerful, but from the Russian range disappeared in line sixes. However, they were bought little, as well as cars with mechanics, but the rear-wheel drive versions turned out to be quite in demand. In general, sales were good. Up to 4,000 more cars were sold per year. So, the secondary market on the model is formed decent. At the moment of writing the material, there were almost 500 cars for sale on Avito. Let's take a look, whether it is difficult to find a good one. In terms of bodywork, the task is easy. The paint quality is decent, and visible defects usually indicate that the car has been restored after an accident. Besides, the age of even early cars is 12 years, and late ones are about 8 years old, which is generally not much. Only minor age problems can be called massive: fading chrome, foggy and sweating headlights, scuffs on plastic, chips on the hood, and windshield edge, as well as paint chips at the joints of bumpers with fenders in cars that have been repeatedly stripped of plastic, breaking the gaps. The whole lower part of the car in crossover fashion is covered with plastic, and defects can also slowly appear under it. For example, they can be found in the attachment points of wheel arch covers and on the metal of sills, especially in the seam zone. The underbody is also likely to have pitting, especially in the rear, around the rear subframe and suspension mounting points. But the most important task will be to find a car without accident history. A cheap BMW was often the first car for a girl or a novice driver, so they were beaten successfully and often, but not always badly. So a repainted hood and replaced bumper can be forgiven, but stretched spars are definitely not. Body repair for X1 can be made much less premium in cost thanks to a decent range of non-original parts. Almost all key parts can be purchased cheaper. For example, instead of an original hood for 50,000 to buy an analog for 20 to 30,000, a front wing to find for 10 to 15,000, instead of 20,000, and a bumper for 10 to 20 instead of 25 to 30. The assortment of windshields is wide. The simplest one can be bought from 7,000 rubles, although the original will cost 25 to 30. Even for optics there are variants of substitutions, though here it will be possible to save not so much. Halogen headlights themselves are not very expensive. 22 to 25,000 for the firm and 16 to 20 for the analog. But bi-xenon optics is in any case expensive. For the original they ask 65 to 70,000, and non-original costs the same money. However, in general, X1 is still quite a good option for restoration after a small accident. In search of spare parts, you will not have to search all the dismantling shops of Russia and neighboring countries, although it is quite possible to find original parts in color and for less money. As we remember, X1 was often bought to girls and as the first car, so the possibility of repair is an important advantage. As we already know, the platform X1 has shared with the 3 and suspensions in general receive the same. In front, there is a McPherson with rotating knuckles and separate lower arms instead of one L-shaped, and behind a multi-lever. Repair of chassis, of course, will not be budgetary, but there are no frankly expensive decisions here. Everything rests in details. For example, front lower levers with hydro-inflated silent blocks cost 8,000 for the original, and a decent non-original will cost 5 to 6,000 for a piece, so that 4 levers will already stand in 20,000. Of course, there are cheaper variants, from 2,000, and rear hydro-inflated silent blocks can be bought separately for 5-3,000. But economy is rarely combined with resource. But the ball bearing is regularly changed, and a decent analog can be bought for 1,500 at the price of the original in 3. Price tags for front shock absorbers start from 5,000, and variants from KYB, Sachs or Bilstein will cost 6 to 8, which is still cheaper than the original for 15. The hub bearing in front is changed in assembly with the hub unit and costs $12,000 for the original and from 6 for a substitute. And behind it can be changed separately for $2,000 to $6,000 instead of 8. Rear levers are not very expensive. If you take non-original, about $2,000 to $4,000 per piece. The only question is that there are 5 levers and rods on each side, including a massive and not cheap lower transverse lever. Silent blocks will help to save on parts, but the work in this case will cost more, and the resource is still in question. And speaking of SIL, the brakes are completely unassuming. Disc brakes on both axles, but with single piston mechanisms even on cars. With 6-cylinder engines with power up to 250 horsepower. Except that discs here ventilated on both axles. In front they have a diameter of 312 millimeters, and behind 300. Expendables are inexpensive. Even an original brake disc can be bought for $6,000 to $8,000, and non-original ones start from $1,500–$2,000. So that a decent detail can be bought for $3,000 to $4,000. Pads are also available. $1,500–$2,000 for a good option. In general, if the brake fluid is not soggy, brake lines are intact, drum parking brake is not sour, and its cables are intact and lubricated, you can move to the next point of inspection. For example, to a steering control, which is constructively usual, with a hydraulic booster, but quite often it is noted by leaks. Of a rack it runs less than 200,000 kilometers. However, here everything is also solved for moderate money. The restored rack can be bought for $25,000 to $35,000 instead of $60,000. Though the price of the rack with Servotronic is appreciably higher, more than $50,000. But the GUR pump is frankly cheap. A non-original unit is available for 6,000 to 7,000 rubles. More than a third of cars on the aftermarket are rear-wheel drive. It is worth remembering this when searching. However, most of them are all-wheel drive variants. All-wheel drive here is quite typical by crossover standards, with an angular gearbox and a multi-disc clutch, which connects the front wheels at the start and when the rear wheels slip. Accordingly, during the inspection, it is worth checking the condition of the gimbal, drive dust covers and the absence of leaks, as well as examine the service history, confirmed by papers. Another important point is the rear gearbox silent blocks. Sudden starts and loads destroy the attachment points, and if you ignore the problem, then sooner or later the dangling gearbox can be lost, along with damaging the drive shafts. BMW X1 2009-15 manual transmission was offered as a basic variant for X1, but it is almost impossible to find a car with it now. They are sold piece by piece. If you would like to have such gearbox, there are no special tricks here, except that 2-mass flywheel at breakage will require about 50,000 rubles. The box itself is quite reliable and can pass more than 250,000 kilometers, especially if you change the oil in it once in 50–60,000. Well, a set of clutch from Luke or Sachs will cost 18,000 to 25,000. The situation with automatic transmissions is more complicated. On the early cars with 6-cylinder engines and some others was installed 6-speed gearbox 6L45R from GM, and the alternative was 6HP19 from ZF. Well, and with restyling the main became a new automatic transmission with an index 8HP45 from the same ZF. If to try to build these units by potential resource, the box from GM will be in the leaders. It is structurally simpler and stronger, because it is initially designed for high loads. Even the torque converter locking linings can serve more than 200,000 kilometers, so when changing oil at least once in 50 to 60,000, the box has chances to pass more than 250,000 before repair. 6-stage automatic transmission from ZF is more sensitive to oil purity, and contaminates it more actively, instead providing good dynamics until the wear of torque converter linings, oil pump, and solenoids does not become critical. It can happen already by 200,000, and if you neglect oil change, even earlier. In this case, the box will be more expensive in repair than the variant from GM, although in general it is well known to specialized services. Well, and the most expensive in repair will still be an 8-speed gearbox. You can read in detail about its features, for example, in the article about BMW 5 Series F1010 material about BMW 5 Series F10 compared. To the 6-speed it is more complicated and hotter, but it is more durable and better able to withstand hard use. True, this does not mean that the box does not need an external radiator and frequent oil changes. And it is also well diagnosed, which allows you to learn about potential problems before buying, so you should not save money on diagnostics. The most difficult, as it often happens with BMW, is the choice of motor. The general list is not so great. If to speak about gasoline motors, initially X1 was equipped with atmospheric 4-cylinder N46 for 2 litres and inline 6 N52 for 3 litres. Later N52 was removed from the range, and instead there was turbocharged 4-cylinder N20 for 2 litres. And diesel engines are variations of the unit N47 with unchanged volume of 2 litres, but with single or double supercharging. Gasoline N46 seems to be the most logical option: chain timing, lack of supercharging, distributed injection. But in practice, you have to pay attention to other things: proprietary throttle-free intake, high operating temperature, and a tendency to oil consumption due to clogging of piston rings. And the price of solving the problem is solid. Usually it is possible to get rid of oil spoilage only by replacing the piston group, which is done by single owners. Well, a canister of oil in the trunk will be more eloquent than any words. Turbocharged N20 is a fresher alternative, but more complicated. There is a supercharger, direct injection, controlled oil pump, electric pump, and so on. There are chances to find a live car with low mileage, but you should be ready for potential investments in advance. Against this background, the 6-cylinder N52 seems to be not ideal, but the most successful option, and in general it is really so. However, cars with it on the secondary market are found piece by piece, and these will be copies of the earliest years of release, so that to diagnostics will still have to approach with all care. The N47 diesel engine cannot be called exemplary either. The most delicate point here is the chain timing with rather unpredictable life and high replacement cost. The latter is explained by the location of the timing chain on the rear side of the engine and the need to remove it for maintenance. In addition, typical potential difficulties with supercharger and fuel equipment have not been cancelled either. However, if you manage to find a late car where the problems with the timing has already been solved and the resource of the turbine and injectors is not yet coming to an end, then the chances of a successful life together with the car will be high. Actually, the choice of motor and configuration and can be given key attention in the selection of the optimal copy of the BMW X1. The most logical choice will be a restyled all-wheel drive crossover with a diesel engine and mileage just over 100 from the first or second owner. Approx like this if Autoteca will confirm the number of owners, mileage, and accident-free history, and service documents, oil change in the box and timing maintenance. Then with such an X1 cannot hope for the rest of the resource, and extend it with good maintenance for another 80 to 100,000 kilometers. The only question is whether you will have enough feeling of premium in simple X1, or your soul will ask for another BMW sooner than in 100,000 kilometers. In conclusion, the BMW X1 I E84 presents a compelling option for those seeking a blend of rear-wheel drive dynamics and advanced engineering. Priced at $1.4 million, it offers a unique driving experience that appeals to enthusiasts and everyday drivers alike. However, potential buyers should weigh the vehicle's performance, maintenance costs, and overall value against their personal preferences and budget. Ultimately, if you prioritize a sophisticated motor and the thrill of rear-wheel drive, the X1 I E84 could be a worthy investment.